My name is Sophia. I am 41 years old. I own a restaurant, not a small one, not a side project. A real restaurant, 64 seats, a full kitchen, a wine list I curated myself, and a reputation in this city that took 11 years and more sleepless nights than I can count to build. I built it from a lease I signed when I had almost nothing, a partner I trusted completely, and a belief that if you did the work with honesty and consistency, the results would speak for themselves. For a long time they did. The restaurant was called Arlen's Table, named after my grandmother Arlene, who had spent 40 years feeding her family with almost no money and more love than most people ever experience at a dinner table. She passed before she could see it open. But I carried her into every decision I made inside those walls. The menu, the warmth of the lighting, the way the host was trained to greet every person who walked through the door as if their arrival was the best thing that had happened all day. That was her. That was all her. My business partner was a man named Richard Hale. I had known Richard for 15 years before we opened the restaurant together. He was smart, well-connected, and he had the kind of easy confidence that made investors feel safe. I provided the vision, the culinary knowledge, the management systems, and the daily presence. He provided startup capital, industry contacts, and the kind of social visibility that gets a restaurant reviewed in the right places in its first year. On paper, we were 50-50. In practice, I ran the restaurant and Richard ran the image of the restaurant. That arrangement worked for a long time. Not perfectly, but well enough that I told myself the small irritations did not matter. Then Richard got married. His wife's name was Claudine. She was elegant in the way that certain people are elegant, meaning she used it as a weapon. She wore her clothes and her opinions with the same certainty, and she had a way of entering a room that suggested she expected it to rearrange itself for her. I tried to like her. I genuinely tried. I told myself that Richard's personal life was not my concern, and that as long as our professional relationship stayed clean, everything would be fine. But Claudine had opinions about the restaurant. And over time, those opinions started arriving in places they had no business being. It started small. She would come in for dinner and make suggestions to the front-of-house staff as if she were a manager. She once told our head server to change the way he described the specials because she found his delivery flat. She rearranged a shelf of wine bottles near the host's stand because she thought the display was uninviting. When I addressed these things calmly with Richard, he would laugh it off and say Claudine just gets enthusiastic and means well. I noted it. I moved on. About a year into their marriage, I started noticing something else. Richard had begun CCing Claudine on business emails that had nothing to do with her. Vendor negotiations, staff scheduling conversations, a thread about our lease renewal. When I asked him about it, he said she had a background in hospitality management and he valued her input. I reminded him that we had a partnership agreement that specified business decisions were to be made jointly between the two of us. He nodded and said, of course. The emails kept coming. I printed every one. I put them in a folder. I was not sure what I was preparing for, but something in my gut said, keep the record. By the second year of their marriage, Claudine had graduated from making suggestions to attending meetings. Not officially. Not with my approval. She would simply show up when Richard and I were scheduled to sit down with a supplier or a contractor, and she would sit beside him and contribute to the conversation as if her presence had been arranged. The first time it happened, I let it go. The second time I said quietly to Richard afterward that I would prefer our business meetings remain between the two of us. He said he understood. The third time she sat at the head of the table. I said nothing in that meeting. I sat through it. I answered the contractor's questions. I took my notes. And when it was over and the contractor had left, I looked at Claudine and said very evenly, this is a business meeting between Richard and me. I appreciate you stopping by, and I stood up and walked to my office. She did not speak to me directly for 4 months after that. I thought perhaps that was the end of it. I thought perhaps the boundary had landed. I was wrong. What happened next happened slowly. That is the thing about a certain kind of manipulation. It does not arrive all at once. It seeps in through the cracks you cannot see until enough water has come through to damage the wall. Richard started showing up less. At first I assumed it was personal. He and Claudine had a busy social life, and he had never been the one managing daily operations anyway. But then I started getting calls from our accountant about approval delays on invoices I had already flagged. I started finding that vendor contracts I had drafted were sitting unsigned for weeks. When I called Richard to ask about the delays, he said he needed more time to review things. He said he wanted to be more involved in the financial side going forward. More involved. In 11 years, he had never once asked to review a vendor contract personally. I called our accountant privately. I asked her to pull the last 18 months of approval records and flag anything that had been delayed, redirected, or queried. She called me back the next morning. Her voice was careful when she spoke. She said, "Sophia, there are some patterns here I think you need to see in person." I went to her office that afternoon. What she showed me was not a single large fraud. It was something more patient and more calculated than that. Over the course of 14 months, a series of small adjustments had been made to the restaurant's expense categorizations. Amounts that should have been recorded as profit distributions had been reclassified as operational costs. Those reclassified costs had been routed through a secondary vendor account that I had never been introduced to. The secondary vendor account belonged to a consulting company. The consulting company's registered address was the same as Richard and Claudine's home. I sat with that information for a long moment. My accountant was quiet. She had laid the papers out carefully on the table in front of me and she was letting me read at my own pace. I read through everything twice. Then I folded my hands on the table and I said, "How long has this account been active?" She said, 14 months. I said, "And how much has moved through it?" She said the total was just under $62,000. I thanked her. I asked her to prepare a full formal report. I asked her to lock the report behind a password that only she and I knew. And then I drove home and I sat in my kitchen and I thought about Richard Hale, who I had known for 15 years and trusted for 11 of them, and his wife Claudine, who had been rearranging my wine bottles and attending my meetings and gradually, methodically, rewriting the story of who owned what. I did not call a lawyer that night. I called my cousin Petra instead. Petra is 4 years older than me and she is an attorney. Not family law, not criminal, she practices business litigation. She had helped me review my original partnership agreement when I signed it. When I told her what I had found, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Sophia, do not touch anything. Do not move any money. Do not send any emails to Richard about this. Do not give him any signal that you know. Just send me what your accountant has and let me look at it tonight." I sent her the files. She called me at 11 the next morning. She said the reclassification pattern was significant. She said the use of a privately held consulting company to absorb restaurant funds without disclosing a conflict of interest was potentially a serious breach of the partnership agreement and possibly a violation of fiduciary duty. She said she wanted to bring in a forensic accountant to go deeper into the records before we made any moves. I said, "Do it." For the next 3 weeks I went to work every day and I ran the restaurant exactly as I always had. I greeted the staff, I reviewed the prep lists, I tasted the sauces. I walked the dining room before service. I answered Richard's texts with normal professional responses. I attended 2 meetings with him and said nothing about what I knew. I smiled when it was appropriate. I kept my voice even. I was so calm on the outside that our head chef told me during one of those weeks that he had never seen me this steady during a busy season. On the inside, I was building a case brick by brick. The forensic accountant's report came back in week 4. It was more detailed than anything I had expected. The $62,000 was just what had cleared. There were additional transactions flagged as structurally suspicious, smaller amounts, different categorizations, some tied to a marketing budget line that had tripled in size over 2 years with no corresponding increase in actual marketing activity. The forensic accountant estimated the full financial impact to be somewhere between $90,000 and $110,000 over 30 months. 30 months, 2.5 years. I thought about the last 2.5 years. I thought about every late night I had spent troubleshooting the kitchen ventilation system, rewriting the staff handbook, negotiating with the linen supplier, developing the winter menu. I thought about every Sunday I had come in on my day off to do inventory because I cared about the accuracy of the numbers. I thought about the fact that while I was doing all of that, money was quietly leaving through a door I had not known existed. Petra called me after I had read the report and she asked me how I was doing. I said I was fine. She said, "Sophia, you are allowed to be angry." I said, "I know." And I was angry, but anger without direction is just noise. I needed mine to go somewhere useful. We decided to move in 2 stages. First, Petra would send a formal letter to Richard's attorney outlining the findings and requesting an immediate accounting of all transactions routed through the consulting company. Second, if his response was insufficient, which Petra expected it to be, we would file a formal complaint for breach of fiduciary duty and seek a dissolution of the partnership on terms that reflected the financial misconduct. The letter went out on a Thursday. Richard called me on Friday morning. His voice was different, not the easy, confident voice I had known for 15 years. Something thinner was underneath it. He said, "Sophia, I think there has been a misunderstanding and I would like to sit down and talk through this before anyone does anything rash." I said, my attorney has advised me to direct all communication to her for now. I am sure your attorney will be in touch. He said, Sophia, we have been partners for over a decade. You and I can talk directly. I said, we will talk through our attorneys. Have a good weekend, Richard. I hung up. That evening I went to the restaurant for the dinner service. I did not tell any of the staff what was happening. It was not their burden to carry, and the restaurant did not deserve to absorb that weight. I walked the floor. I checked in with the kitchen. I spoke to guests. I poured a glass of wine for a table celebrating an anniversary, and I meant it when I wished them a happy one. That is when it happened. The restaurant was full. It was a Saturday evening, which is always our strongest night, and the room had that particular energy that only comes when everything is working, when the kitchen is running clean and the servers are confident and the guests have settled into their meals and the noise is warm and layered instead of sharp. I love that energy. I have loved it for 11 years. It is the closest thing I know to the feeling my grandmother described when she talked about a table full of people she cared for. I was standing near the service station at the back of the dining room when I heard her voice. Claudine had come in with a group. 4 women, all dressed for a night out, all arriving with the energy of people who expect a certain kind of welcome. The host had seated them, and I had not yet noticed they were there. But then I heard her voice rise above the ambient sound of the room, and I turned. She was looking at me, and she had the expression of someone who had just found something unpleasant in an otherwise pleasant environment. She said, loudly enough for the tables nearby to hear, "Can somebody get the manager, please? Actually, get the owner. I need to speak to the owner about this woman right here." Her friends turned to look at me. A few guests at nearby tables glanced over. One of my servers stopped mid-step. I looked at Claudine. I did not move. She said, "I am serious. I do not know why this person is standing here, but I want her removed from the floor. This is a professional establishment." One of her friends put a hand on her arm, but Claudine was not interested in being quieted. She said, "I have every right to ask. I am connected to the ownership of this restaurant and I will not sit here while," I said, "you are connected to someone who is no longer a partner in this restaurant, effective 3 days ago." The table went very quiet. I said, "My name is Sophia. I am the sole owner of Arlen's table. I have been the owner since it opened, and I would like to welcome you to dinner." Claudine's mouth opened, and then it closed. One of her friends made a small sound that might have been a laugh, quickly converted into. Another one looked down at her menu with sudden intense interest. I said, "Your server tonight will be Marcus. He will take excellent care of you. I hope you enjoy your evening," and I walked back to the service station. My hands were perfectly steady. I want to explain what I meant when I said effective 3 days ago, because that piece of information did not arrive without a fight. After Petra sent the formal letter, Richard's attorney responded in exactly the way Petra had predicted. They denied any wrongdoing. They characterized the consulting company invoices as legitimate advisory services. They provided a document, a thin one, hurriedly prepared, that purported to be a service agreement between the restaurant and the consulting company. Petra reviewed the service agreement and sent back a 5-page response that identified 11 specific deficiencies in it, including the absence of any counter-signature from me, the absence of any board approval notation, the fact that the services described were vague to the point of meaninglessness, and the fact that the payment schedule did not align with the dates on the invoices. She attached the forensic accountant's full report as an exhibit. Richard's attorney went quiet for 4 days. On the 5th day, they proposed a settlement. Richard would agree to dissolve the partnership. He would waive his claim to any future profits. He would accept a buyout at a valuation that accounted for the misappropriated funds as an offset against his equity. He would sign over his 50% share of the business. In exchange, we would not pursue the matter further. Petra called me and walked me through the terms. She said it was a strong offer. She said we could push for more in litigation, but that it would take 18 months minimum and cost significantly in legal fees. She said the outcome would be uncertain and the process would be public and damaging to the restaurant's reputation regardless of how it ended. I asked her one question. I said, "If I accept this offer, do I walk away clean?" She said, "You walk away as the sole owner of a business that is doing well, with a financial settlement that partially compensates for the losses, and with no ongoing legal entanglement to a person you no longer want in your life." I said, "Send them the paperwork." The dissolution was signed 3 days before Claudine walked into my restaurant and demanded I be removed from the floor. I do not think she knew. I think Richard had not told her. I think she walked in that evening still believing she was connected to something she had already lost. And I think the look on her face when I told her who I was is something she will carry for a long time. Not because I wanted her to suffer, because the truth has a way of landing exactly when it needs to. In the weeks after the dissolution, several things happened that I had not fully prepared for. Richard's name had been on the restaurant's public profile in various ways, on the website, on some early press, on a plaque near the entrance that listed the founding partners. I had those things updated quietly and professionally. The plaque was replaced with a new one that read simply, Arlene's Table, founded by Sophia in honor of Arlene. The staff noticed. A few of them asked me privately if everything was all right. I told them that the business had undergone a structural change and that the restaurant was in a strong position going forward. That was true, and it was enough. What I had not expected was the number of people in our professional circle who reached out. Richard was well known in the local hospitality industry. He had connections at several other restaurants, at a culinary school, at a hospitality investment group that had approached us the previous year about expansion. When word got around, and in this industry, word always gets around, that the partnership had dissolved, my phone started ringing in a way it had not in years. Some calls were from people checking in out of genuine concern. Some were from people doing reconnaissance on behalf of Richard, which I recognized quickly and handled briefly. And some were from people who wanted to say, without saying it directly, that they had noticed what had been happening and that they respected what I had done. One of those calls came from the culinary school's program director. She said she had heard about the change and wanted to invite me to speak to the next graduating class. She said she believed the students needed to hear from someone who had built something real and protected it when it mattered. I said yes. I stood in front of 43 graduating culinary students 3 months later, and I told them a version of this story. I did not name Richard. I did not give them details that were not mine to share publicly. But I told them about what it feels like to build something you love, and what it costs when that thing is threatened, and what it requires to protect it with clarity instead of anger. I told them, documentation is not distrust. It is the language of accountability. Keep your records, know your agreements, and when something feels wrong, do not wait for it to feel more wrong before you act. Several of them came up to me afterward. One young woman held my hand and told me her mother had built a small business and lost it to a bad partnership, and that hearing my story made her feel like there was a different ending possible. I thought about my grandmother when she said that. I thought about how Arlene would have looked at this young woman and known exactly what to say to her. I did not cry, but it was close. The restaurant is doing well, better than well, actually. In the 18 months since the dissolution, I have made several changes that I had wanted to make for years, but that had stalled in the approval process Richard and I had built into our structure. I brought on a new head pastry chef whose dessert menu has been mentioned in 3 reviews in the past year. I redesigned the Priva tea dining room in a way that has made it one of the most requested spaces for intimate events in the city. I extended our weekend hours and partnered with a local urban farm for a seasonal ingredients program that the kitchen team has embraced with a kind of enthusiasm that reminds me why I got into this in the first place. I also hired a second accountant, not because I do not trust my existing one, but because I now understand that 2 sets of eyes on financial records is not paranoia. It is simply good stewardship. Claudine sent me a message about 6 months after that evening in the restaurant. It came through a mutual acquaintance rather than directly, which told me everything I needed to know about how much courage was behind it. The message said she had not known the full extent of what Richard had done and that she was sorry for how she had behaved. I read it once. I did not respond, not out of cruelty. There was simply nothing I needed from that conversation. Richard I have not heard from directly since the dissolution papers were signed. I understand he has moved to another city. I do not know what he is doing there, and I do not spend energy wondering. What I think about instead is this. I think about a 29-year-old woman who signed a lease she could barely afford on a space that needed 6 weeks of renovation before it could open its doors, because she believed something beautiful could be built there. I think about her standing in the empty dining room the night before opening, listening to the sound of the city outside, and feeling the particular terror and clarity that comes when you have committed completely to something and there is no road back. I think about what she would say if she could see what the room looks like now. I think she would say, "You kept it. Through everything you kept it," and I would tell her yes, but I had to learn what keeping it actually meant. It did not mean holding on without question. It meant knowing what was yours, protecting it with precision, and never confusing loyalty to a person with loyalty to the thing you both promised to build. Those are different things. It took me 11 years and a forensic accountant to understand exactly how different. The night Claudine pointed at me and told someone to have me removed, she did not know she was pointing at the woman who had opened every email at 6 in the morning, who had trained every server, who had tasted every dish before it left the kitchen, who had negotiated every lease clause, who had stayed every closing night long after everyone else had gone home. She did not know she was pointing at the woman whose grandmother's name was on the door, but I knew, and that was enough. I am 41 years old, I own a restaurant. It is mine, fully and completely, in a way it has never been before. My grandmother would be proud, I am sure of it, not because I won something, because I kept something worth keeping, and I did it with documentation, patience, and the kind of quiet that is louder than any scream.